I have with me one of Kawsachun News's half, Ollie Vargas. And Ollie, of course, works with Camilla, who we've been on the ground with multiple times. And we love the work you guys do. And it's really, I'm excited to have you on because you're a Bolivian in part, and I'm Peruvian. And there is a lot of just commonality and a lot of things to discuss between of what's happening now in Peru and what happened in Bolivia in 2019. So welcome, Ollie. Thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you for having me on to talk about this.
Yeah, so this isn't really being covered the way it should. Okay, so from the ousting, of course, of Pedro Castillo, which I covered his election, and from the beginning, his election was riddled with a lot of bias against him because of where he came from, because he was from the rural area of Peru, because he was who he was. There was obviously the country has a racist past, but also economic space. The fact that he was challenging the establishment of Peru, which we know the Congress of Peru has so much power and has gotten rid of the last, I believe, 7 or 8 presidents that the country has had. And now, of course, Dina Boluarte is the current president. Castillo was pretty much betrayed by the majority of the people around him. He didn't really have a chance to govern the way it was intended. And we're at the point where Peru's indigenous rural population has rebelled against the establishment, which a lot of people, I don't think this has been discussed enough, is obviously it's a US backed, but there is intelligence, of course, at play here too. And you're on the ground in Peru. And just first of all, I just want to ask, what do you think is the most important thing that people who aren't familiar with what's going on in Peru, who haven't heard, should know about the current demonstrations against the government by the people of Peru?
Yeah, well, the past couple of days, I've been in Desaguadero, which is like the border town in Peru, it's on the border with Bolivia, and I'm back in La Paz now. And essentially, there's everything was absolutely closed. There's nothing, restaurants or anywhere to stay because everyone is taking part in a general strike. It's total shutdown in pretty much the whole of the south of Peru. There wasn't even any government workers, like no migration staff, no police. The police had left, had basically retreated from those areas. And when I saw the protests of people, the people were holding in that town, it was clear that they're not going to back down at all. In fact, it's going to grow. Yesterday they said that in 2 days they're going to be sending thousands of people to Lima, the capital city, and not have the protests just in our regions. And the protests are going on pretty much across the whole of the south, which is sort of indigenous Andean, also in some Amazonian areas, and even in Lima itself, where we had protests, not necessarily the strike that we've seen in the rest of the country, but there's still been large protests in Lima. And so in the next couple of days, we're going to be seeing sort of thousands of people from the indigenous Andean South going to the capital city. And their demand is just the fall of the government, the resignation of the president, Dina Boluarte, especially, and that has, I think, become non-negotiable ever since Monday when there was a massacre carried out in the town of Juliaca. My plan was originally to go to there, but it was pretty much impossible because there's so many sort of barricades erected by protesters all along the different highways going towards across the whole of the south of the country, so it's impossible to move about. But being there in just crossing the border from Bolivia to Peru, could see the strength of the feeling. There was all the different communities from around the town as well flooding in to join the protest. The protests themselves were completely blocked off the border with Bolivia. They allowed me through so that I could, report on it, but no one is allowed in or out. There's huge, the huge exports that Bolivia has to Peru is obviously completely paralyzed. It's a total shutdown in most of the country, and they give no sign at all of backing down.
The way media has covered this in what I've seen in Western media particularly is the protesters are using violent tactics. We had Ben Shapiro say, "Oh, well, Brazil is being covered so much by media because they're framing them as right-wing violent protesters." Meanwhile, the media isn't covering Peru because it's a bunch of left-wing rioters. So that's like the sentiment of course, of a lot of people, and the protests largely aren't being covered. I mean, even in independent media, this isn't being discussed the way it should be discussed. And it reminds me of the Bolivian coup in 2019, where it was happening and people were getting murdered. And nobody was really talking about it, save you guys and a few other people. So, what exactly do you say about the framing that these people are being violent, they're stopping the economy, they're just being there's another group that is the counter protester movement that is saying, oh hey, we want to bring peace to the region. What do you say to that and the way that's being pushed out?
Yeah, well, there was coverage initially when Pedro Castillo was arrested. Essentially, what happened there was the president, sort of a more progressive president, Pedro Castillo, he announced that he was going to suspend Congress and call new elections. And the reason for this was that Congress was going to vote to impeach him and install a right-wing government that was going to do all the things that we've seen happen. And he was trying to prevent that by calling new congressional elections. However, the Congress then votes to impeach him anyway, and the police and military back the Congress, in which right wing parties have a majority in. And a lot of those parties in Congress, I'd say, more like shell companies, by different business interests and stuff like this. So there was a lot of coverage in media about that, saying, "Oh, Pedro Castillo, this is anti-democratic. He's closing down Congress. This is awful, etc., etc." And then once the new government was installed, people were saying this is a victory for democracy, etc. And then once the killing started against the indigenous majority in the country, that's where the coverage ended, and we haven't really heard anything since then. So that's and of course the reason we haven't heard anything since then is because the new government is a close ally of the US government. Is a country that is attacking the progressive governments of the region, like Bolivia, like Argentina, Mexico, Colombia. So I mean, it's in a context in which the rest of South America is electing left-wing governments, is incredibly important for the US to have an outpost there in Peru. So that's why we haven't really seen any critical coverage in US media, even as the deaths pile up. Even in December, when the death toll was about 30, we didn't have any coverage. After Monday, when the massacre in Juliaca, we didn't see almost any coverage. Or the coverage that there was, it would be to say that there were clashes and 10 dead in violent clashes in Peru, which obscures the fact that only one side was doing the killing. None of the death toll, in the death toll of about 46 total in Peru, none of them are military or police. All of them are civilians killed by military and police. So it's not clashes, it's massacre, and that's what is not reported on in the media.
Yeah, and along those lines of what we're talking about, the U.S. involvement, what is your opinion about the fact that, of course, Elisa Kenna, who worked for the CIA for 9 years, has been out vocally saying, well, we're going to work with Peru to curtail on the drug trafficking problem, who immediately backed, along with the OAS, the former or vice president, current president, Dina Boluarte, who without question just recognized this government, in contrast to, of course, some of the Latin American countries that you mentioned that were saying Pedro Castillo deserves asylum, he deserves to be heard. And of course, his family went to Mexico, but he wasn't allowed. How involved is, in your opinion, the CIA in perhaps other security agencies, and why specifically? I mean, we talk about Peru and Bolivia, we talk about lithium, we talk about copper, we talk about rich natural resources. One of the things that Pedro Castillo's party and he went in with was no more poor people in a rich country, which is exactly what goes on, of course, in many of our Latin American countries. Wealth is exported out of the country. And one of the things that Castillo never got to do was to really hold these multinational corporations that are, of course, very friendly with Keiko Fujimori's government, with the right wing Congress. What is your opinion on those connections?
Yeah, as I said, the U.S. ambassador in Peru, Lisa Kenna, she was 9 years, I think, at the CIA. She worked for Mike Pompeo. She worked in the Iraq political office during the Iraq War, and has had a number of sort of diplomatic posts in Middle Eastern countries where there's conflicts, where the US is involved in conflicts. So yeah, she's clearly an operator. Just after the coup, she announced a big a sort of multi-million cooperation agreement, multi-million dollar cooperation agreement to fund Peru's anti-drug efforts, and that's basically a cover for saying that today the US is going to be funding the security forces, the military and the police, under the guise of anti-drug work, but really it's happening just at the time as the repression is going on. So the US is backing that and funding that repression, and of course the two countries with the highest production of cocaine in the world is Colombia and Peru. And Colombia, for all its history up until literally a year ago, was always had pro-US governments. In fact, Colombia's always been the closest ally for the United States in Latin America. And Peru's always been a close ally of the United States as well. And those are the two countries with the highest level of cocaine production in the world, by a very large margin. So we know that the United States is not serious about that. The Irish using it to funnel money to the forces of repression in Peru. And yeah, in terms of the regional reaction, Bolivia, Mexico, and Colombia and Argentina currently still don't recognize the government of Dina Boluarte. She wasn't elected, and they still refer to Pedro Castillo as President Pedro Castillo. And it's, if this had happened a couple of years ago, the government of Peru now would be a lot stronger. But now they're actually quite isolated, and they're pushing themselves into further isolation by attacking all these countries. There's, even people in Congress saying that Bolivia's ambassador should be expelled. They banned Evo Morales from entering the country. They're trying to use him as a scapegoat for wider protests are happening. And yeah, that's how they're trying to explain away why the majority of people are upset, but it's actually making people a lot more upset, because it's basically delegitimizing why they're going onto the streets by saying that you're just being controlled by a foreign puppet master, when they're there for domestic demands, which is the resignation of the government, constituent assembly to create a new constitution, nationalization of natural resources, because in the current constitution in Peru, natural resources are privatized by law, by constitution. So people want to overturn that whole setup.
Hey, Ollie. Craig Pasta Jardula here, the other half of the Convo Couch. I'm sorry, emergency in my room today, so I wasn't going to come on. But I do have a question, and I've been dying to ask you because I was watching some of your coverage on Democracy Later the other day. Great work. And you had talked about the demands from the people out in the streets. Number one, they wanted the immediate government that has been christened by Lisa Kenna and the West to step down immediately. Number two, they wanted snap elections, meaning right away, have an election right away. But number three was kind of interesting, and you kind of alluded to it right now. And I think that might be the underlying problem that a lot of people aren't necessarily looking at, and that is Peru's constitution. What about Peru's constitution, other than the natural resources part about privatization that needs to be changed? Because I see a lot of similarities here with Peru, the way their constitution is kind of framed, to where the West can come in and just remove a president. Very similar to what we see in Pakistan, where Imran Khan was removed with a couple phone calls from the State Department. Isn't Peru's constitution one of the underlying issues right here that really needs to be changed? Because even if they get a new president, why can't they just do this to the next president if the West doesn't like that president? And thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And the constitution that Peru has now was created in the 90s by the dictator Alberto Fujimori, which is the last dictator that Peru has had. He was obviously a very, very close ally of the United States. And they created a constitution in which, you do have the privatization of natural resources enshrined into law, in which you don't recognize the indigenous nations of Peru, which are the majority of people who are now protesting. And that's what people are demanding, really. One constitution is similar to that of Bolivia, in which, for example, the cooperation with the United States, United States military presence is illegal under the Constitution and under law. That's the sort of things that people want in a new constitution that would be created by a constituent assembly, and that's why the current government want to block that at all costs. And in fact, there's even a Congress person, the president of the Congress in Peru, has put forward a proposal to go into law that would ban any political party that doesn't believe in the current constitution from standing in elections. So that means that no one who believes in repealing the current constitution would even be allowed to stand in any possible elections, which would mean that there would be sham elections. So those are the sorts of things that people want to change. But the issue of natural resources is really central, and even at the protest I was at yesterday, that was one of the main points people were raising, because next year, well, essentially this year and next year, we're going to have a lot of the state concessions for things like lithium and gas, gold, etc., where the state gives out to foreign companies. And that's why the government said there's not going to be elections until 2024, until all of these contracts have been given out to transnational companies. So people said there has to be elections now, so that people have the possibility to take back those resources rather than just handing them out to US and Canadian corporations.
Oh, he's muted. Ollie, you're muted. Ollie, you muted your mic. I can't hear him.
It's definitely his microphone, though, so I have nothing muted over here and stuff. I'll leave you. Nothing.
Something, yeah. I don't know. Something's going on with your mic, Ollie.
Deep
Because we
state.
can't hear you. No.
He was getting into the good stuff, man. He was getting into the whole crux of it. Like, all right, like this is like what people don't understand is that, there's a lot of finances that are involved. They think that it was just Pedro Castillo in that Twitter space I was in. Like, no, he was trying to break the law and go against the Constitution. And that's why they legally removed him. But we're like, no, there's a lot of lithium at play. Ollie, do we have you back yet?
Hello, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I was just saying that the concessions that the Peruvian government will be giving out to foreign companies is coming up, and that's why people want elections right now. And the regions where there's the most protests, the south of Peru and the indigenous Andean regions, that's where all of this is, including the Amazonian regions as well, all of the gas, all of the mining minerals. Yet these are the poorest regions of the country, yet they're the ones who fund the whole development of the country through the natural resources. So the only way to change that situation will be to take back the natural resources into public hands, and so that the regions that actually have these resources are the ones that can benefit from it. And that is what the Peruvian government and the US Embassy are the most opposed to. That's the crux of the issue, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just a couple more questions, Ollie, because I think it's important to talk about Bolivia as well, with what's happening in Peru. What similarities do you see with what happened in 2019 as in terms of the geopolitical aspect, in terms of the regional aspect, but also what mistakes, what could people do to not allow another massacre to occur without it being covered the way it should, like it wasn't, frankly, in 2019 in Bolivia?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we do maintain coverage and we do point out why the media doesn't want to, especially sort of international US-based media, doesn't want to cover what's going on in Peru and what's at stake there. The fact that the government's only been in power about, I think, like 43 or 44 days, and they killed 46 people in that time. So more deaths than days in power. And yeah, but I think the coup in Bolivia, although that also didn't get media attention, I think we did actually force it onto into public debate. But by the sort of small platform we have, I think we were able to punch above our weight and show the world what's going on. So I think people are a bit more aware. They do smell the rat when it comes around a bit more easily. It is a bit easier to identify these things as they're happening and to see the similarities. And there is a lot of similarities with why this happened and why the coup in Bolivia happened. So yeah, I think people it is programs like this and our own outlet is helping people to join the dots and raise awareness, and that's the most important thing, because I think the US government relies on people when they carry out things like this. They rely on either people not knowing what's going on and they can all just do this without anyone bothering them, or if they do know, then there's propaganda to say why it's absolutely right that it did happen and it was good, and in fact the US is helping these people from their own incompetence, whatever. So the more we can break through that, the harder it becomes for the US government to carry these things out.
Well, in the macro aspect, Ollie, we have seen what many call a pink tide in Latin America. Progressive governments like in Argentina, Mexico, Honduras. You have obviously Bolivia having recuperated from the 2019 coup attempt of full-on coup of Evo Morales. And then you have, of course, other countries like Peru that were able to gain somebody like Pedro Castillo. But of course, now we see the ousting of that. We have Lula da Silva in Brazil. Of course, we just saw what happened, which I think there's so much that could go into that. But is there an actual pink tide? Or is there something else? Do you think that Latin America is moving to the left? And what is the left in Latin America? Because a lot of people in the United States have an idea of what leftism is that, in my opinion, just isn't reflected in the politics of Latin America.
Well, there is a majority of countries that have elected left-wing or progressive governments in the region, especially in South America, even in Central America as well. We've got Honduras, there's Mexico as well that's played an important leadership role in the region. And I think that those numbers could increase even further over the next few years. However, what we're also seeing is that there is a certain weakness to this current wave of governments that have been elected. Obviously, Pedro Castillo was only elected a year and a half ago, and there's this coup. I would say that sort of a soft coup had already taken place in Peru a long time ago, when Pedro Castillo was forced to take out some of his sort of more left-wing ministers. I think that was a sign of how weak the government was. In Argentina, for example, we've seen numerous, like assassination attempts against the vice president Cristina Kirchner. We've seen the fact that they haven't been able to get over the legacy of the right-wing president Mauricio Macri that essentially plunged Argentina into massive debt with the IMF to such an extent that the country is still reeling from that, and they're still experiencing inflation and a debt crisis. In numerous countries of the region, we see a certain weakness of the government being elected, but that doesn't change the fact that there is a majority of countries that have elected progressive presidents. They're not all of the same hue, so to speak. I think Bolivia's government, for example, has a much more clear ideological and political direction around nationalization of natural resources and around state-led investment growth. Whereas countries, for example, like Chile with President Boric, has had a much more it's had a much slower pace of change. They haven't implemented a lot of these policies. They haven't normalized relations with Venezuela, for example, and Cuba. So there is as well a certain variation within these governments. So it's difficult to find what left means. I think for me, I would say the most important principles would be that of sovereignty and national independence away from the United States. And so I think that ties together most of the left-wing governments in Latin America, even including, for example, Mexico under President López Obrador, which doesn't have as left-wing policies, economically as, say, Bolivia, but which I think has taken a very, very clear stance about protecting its national sovereignty and national independence. So I think that's why there has been a lot of positive cooperation between Mexico and most of the left-wing governments in Latin America. So even though there is ideological differences, where there is a commitment to national independence and sovereignty is where I say we can say that there is a left-wing tide, at least in the majority of countries in Latin America.
And in terms of Peru, it seems like the country is obviously it is in a dire situation right now. It's been going through presidents because the Congress is all too powerful and controls much of the government. Do you think these protests will end, and if they do end, under what circumstances? And also, what do you think needs to happen to get Peru out of this situation that it's in? For a long time, Peru has obviously been, as you mentioned earlier, a partner of the United States. When you go to Lima, you see the neoliberalism. And when you talk to Peruvians in the United States, the majority of them, of course, were not in favor of a lot of them, of Pedro Castillo, at least the ones in Florida that I'm aware of. And so you see a lot of the same situations with some expats that have left the country. And one of the main things of Pedro Castillo and Peru Libre was and his supporters was that Peru is not Lima, right? And so when we talk about the interests of Peru, most people just imagine Lima, but what we're seeing here is that all the forgotten people outside of Lima are coming to the forefront and demanding to be seen and heard.
Yeah, in terms of how this will end, how this sort of crisis conflict will end, for me, I only really see two options, and that is that the government itself resigns, and the other one, being more pessimistic, is that the piece of the graveyard, as they say, is that the repression will just increase. There'll be more massacres to the point where protests just back down just to end the deaths and end the killings, because they're not able to withstand it anymore. I think those are the two options, because there was attempts at dialogue even on Monday that broke down because the massacres were taking place. So there's no really, and because of the amount of deaths there have been, the government, if they step down, they will face prosecution, they'll face jail time, they would have to leave the country. So they don't really have they don't have an option for a negotiated way out. So I think we see the one side winning or the other. It depends how, if the army and the police have got enough stocks to force people into submission. That is what I think is probably the most likely. I hope, of course, I'm wrong on that. And the other option I mentioned of the government leaving and fleeing the country, I think that is also still a possibility. So we have to keep an eye on that. And the way I heard people speak was that they're not going to accept anything other than a resignation of the government. And you even got regional governors, who are not part of the left but governors in the areas where they've been massacred, saying that, the only way people are going to calm down is with the resignation of the government. So I think those are the two main possibilities. And in terms of, the real divide as well is between Lima and the rest of the country in terms of sort of cosmopolitan elite versus the majority of the country in towns, villages that have almost nothing in common with each other. I think we see this even among the left in Peru. That is based in Lima, that is more middle class, based around universities, where they have very different priorities compared to the unions and the movements that we see in the rest of the country. I mean, I've seen, I used to live in Peru as well. The sort of priorities among certain middle class leftists in Lima is around things like environmentalism or certain identity politics. Whereas in the south of Peru, the indigenous Andean areas, that's not something that is the priorities for people. There is the issue of taking back natural resources, the issue of equality between Lima and the rest of the country, of national development. So we see a disconnect on everything, even within the left. And so, yeah, that's the big divide. And people in Lima, when people from like the Andes go and live there, they're called immigrants or invaders, within their own country. So it seems like an almost unbridgeable gap. But I think the only way to bridge it would be through a recognition of the country's diversity, like Bolivia has. Bolivia is a plurinational state and a constitution in which everyone has played a role in drawing up, rather than one that was imposed by one person during the Fujimori dictatorship. So I think those are some of the ways that you can begin to bridge the sort of urban-rural divide.
And my last question is, we see the focus right now in Ukraine via the State Department. The State Department is focused on this proxy war with Russia via Ukraine. We see NATO backing, of course, the collective of NATO backing that. However, there is always Latin America and Africa in the background due to the natural resources we've talked about. Do you see a refocus on Latin America, and perhaps Latin America's emerging and growing relationship with China, with this incoming multipolarity? We're seeing, of course, Brazil stay in BRICS, more countries join BRICS, Brazil joining CELAC. We're seeing this sort of more community and building and relationship building in Latin America, Colombia, Venezuela. All of this is happening. Do you see the State Department once again focusing, and did they ever actually stop focusing on Latin America?
Yeah, I think the election of Lula in Brazil, I think, is quite important in terms of strengthening Latin American unity, because with Bolsonaro, obviously Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America, the largest economy, so they have a huge amount of power. And what we saw in Bolsonaro was him turning away from Latin America, away from Latin American integration. When Trump was in power, Brazil was turning towards the US. When Biden was in power, he sort of burnt his bridges there. But he always broke all projects for Latin American integration. And so Brazil rejoining CELAC is important, because that is basically the only real forum for Latin American countries to come together without the presence of the United States and Canada. And that's why the US is very opposed to this. The US only wants organizations like the OAS, in which you have Canada and the United States there, and who can throw their power and weight about to set the agenda. But when you have forums like CELAC, and CELAC is not a left-wing organization. It has all of the countries of Latin America, whether it be left-wing governments or right-wing governments or whatever. But the point is that it is Latin America and the Caribbean, without the US and Canada, because they don't have the same interests. So that rebuilding that is incredibly important. I think we're going to see the BRICS expanding. Bolivia is even as well, proposing that it be included in a sort of BRICS plus, with a sort of a wider layer of smaller countries that are also emerging economies that also have strong growth. It is incredibly important. People's focus should be on Latin America. I think this is where some of the most interesting things are happening. This is where I think a certain war for influencers is happening. What we're seeing in the United States with the US government sort of pretending to be in favor of, pretending to oppose the attempts against Lula, stuff like this. I think we can understand that as a way to court Lula away from China because Brazil's ties with China are increasing by the day. That's something that happened both under Bolsonaro and now Lula. I think it's going to expand even more under Lula. The United States is very, very, very concerned about that, very worried about that. They want to try and stop that process as much as possible. So I think we're probably going to see some, friendly gestures from the US towards Brazil to try and prevent that from happening. But it's something that's already, the wheel's already in motion for that because China offers a partnership for mutual economic development, but also non-interference in internal political affairs. China's a country that has relations with right-wing governments in Latin America, with left-wing governments in Latin America. They don't discriminate based on, whatever your national government is. Whereas the United States has completely the opposite approach, where they, even the smallest things about your domestic policies they want to dictate, and they issue condemnations and all these sorts of things constantly. So that's the process of Latin American countries, even right-wing governments like Uruguay, grow every day, stepping up their cooperation with China because it is just a better deal. So, yeah, depending on how fast that process is, I think it's something very interesting to keep an eye on.
Well, Ollie, just let the audience know any things you guys plan on doing at Kawsachun, anything else that you are planning, any shows you're on, anything else that you want to let the audience know.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure to follow us, obviously, www.kawsachunnews.com, also on Twitter @KawsachunNews. My co-founder Camila is in Brazil at the moment, reporting on events in Brazil. I was just in Peru, and yeah, we're on top of everything going on in Latin America, and we've also got our show, our podcast, Latin America Review, that you can find on podcast apps, and we cover all of these topics on there. And we just had a show yesterday as well about Peru. So yeah, keep informed on there as well.
Thank you very much, Ollie, for coming on, and we'll definitely be following along with your coverage. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks, Ollie.
Thanks, Craig.